Well, good morning. It's a communion Sunday, and because you all talk so long, this service might go a little long. So just be patient. If you gotta go, just get up and go. It's okay. All right, I'm gonna get this out of the way. My mobile sound is on. All right, show of hands. Who has not watched or read any news in the last, say, 14 hours? So some of you may not be aware that former President Trump was shot in the ear yesterday. Obviously the shooter was aiming for his head. Mr. Trump moved his head just in the nick of time. At least one person sitting in the bleachers behind him was killed, and it's a kind of a big mess right now, right? So I want to encourage us as Christians to not engage in all the conspiracy theory stuff that's already going around. Okay? We're looking at the world through a soda straw every time we watch something on the news or read something in the news, okay? And every time we listen to somebody who's just making stuff up, right, to make themselves sound smart, and then we parrot that and we repeat that, it's kind of like playing the telephone game or the rumor game. We weren't there. We don't know what happened. We don't know what decisions were made, what policy decisions were made, why the Secret Service wasn't on that particular roof, why they're only over on the other roof. I don't know, right? I have some of the same questions myself, right? However, it sure makes for interesting politics, doesn't it? I thought it was interesting after watching that first presidential debate and then a couple of his press the current president's press conferences after that. Boy, that was disastrous. It's really disastrous now. So anyhow, it's going to be fascinating to watch, and I think that's what we need to do as Christians. We need to watch, but we've got to be careful what we say to each other and what we say in public. Because it's very easy for us, right? It's very easy for us to sit there and point all of our fingers, right? And shake our heads and get mad and spout things about the other party, right? And what they've said in the past. It's not helpful for us to do that. Our focus needs to be on Christ. Our focus needs to be on sharing the good news of Jesus Christ with a very lost world. Okay? That's where our focus needs to be. Our love and our devotion needs to go to Jesus, not to a politician. Not saying don't support your favorite guy. I'm not telling you to not do that, right? What I'm saying is, as Christians, our citizenship is in heaven. That's our eternal citizenship. Our citizenship here, our secular citizenship, if you want to call that, it's really temporary because, eventually we're all going to die anyway, right? Our eternal citizenship is in heaven. We run the risk, especially those of us who are, maybe politically fairly conservative, we run the risk of becoming a lot like the scribes and the Pharisees in the New Testament. I mean, I certainly run that risk. Okay? So I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but I'm also preaching to myself. I run the risk of acting, behaving, and treating people the same way that the Pharisees treated their people, and certainly the way they treated Jesus. So in Matthew chapter 23, as things are coming to a head, now remember we already had Easter this year already, right? We've already had, Good Friday and, Crucifixion, Resurrection Day and all that stuff. We've already had that. But here in Matthew, we're looking at that period of time, that 1 week period of time between his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, his crucifixion, and his resurrection. That 1 week period of time. And things come to a head here in Matthew chapter 23. As the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the religious leaders, they're questioning Jesus, trying to trap him, and eventually they kind of give up. And so Jesus steps out into the outer court of the temple, and he's going to call out the scribes and the Pharisees particularly. He doesn't call out the Sadducees, he calls out the scribes, that's the religious lawyers who worked for and with the Pharisees, right? And remember who the Pharisees were? If we have to assign them politically, they were conservative. Right? They were Jewish, conservative. They're conservative religiously, probably conservative politically. They're also nationalists. They did not want Rome ruling over their country. Well, probably nobody that lived there did, except for the ones that were making money off of it. The guys like, the tax collectors. Right? So they weren't a whole lot different than we are. And Jesus is going to call them out here in Matthew chapter 23. And he's going to use a particular word. In Greek, it's oil. In English, that's translated as woe. Not woe horsey, right? That's W-O-A-H. But woe as in woe is me. Woe are you, W-O-E. Woe is like a terrible lament. And he's going to use this word over and over and over again. In King James, he uses it 8 times. In some translations, they condense it down to 7. I'm not going to get into numbers and numerology. That's silly to do that. But when Jesus says, woe is you, woe are you Pharisees, we better put ourselves in that position. Woe is me if I think this way. Woe is me if I treat people the way the Pharisees have treated people. Woe is my country, because my country, nationally, oftentimes, does what the Pharisees do to people. And we better pay attention. We'll start in Matthew chapter 23, verse 1. Then Jesus spoke. Oh, no, we're going to go to verse 13, because we already did 1 through 12, like last week, didn't we? Let's start in 13. So he's addressed, right? He's addressed the Pharisees. Now he's addressing the people, okay? And he's saying, woe to you Pharisees. There's Pharisees listening. So Christian, are you listening to what Jesus has to say to you here in this passage? You better be. I need to be. So we'll start in verse 13 of chapter 23. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. These are religious leaders. He's saying, you're shutting the door to heaven by your behavior, by your words and your actions. They go together, by the way. We have to be careful as Christians not to block people from the kingdom of heaven by the political stuff we spew, or the political things we repeat. Let's not block people from the kingdom of heaven. Verse 14, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation. The Pharisees would take advantage of widows and either seize their houses or buy them, 10 cents on the dollar kind of a thing, so that they could turn around and make profit. As Christians, we need to be careful about taking advantage of those who are less advantaged than we are. The history of Christianity is ripe with things like this over the last 2,000 years. Our nation has also done this throughout its history, taking advantage of those who cannot protect themselves. We need to be, again, very careful that we do not do this. Those Pharisees also, they made a big deal about their long prayers, trying to make themselves look good. So on one hand, they're trying to make themselves look good, acting all pious, and on the other hand, they're ripping people off. Jesus says, therefore, you will receive greater condemnation. When the church acts like one thing, or the priest or the pastor or whatever, and then does another behind the scenes, we're going to be condemned for that. When our nation says one thing, when our nation says, hey, we've got this Constitution, I think it's a great document for what it is. It's a government document, right? It's a governing document. As great as it is, it's not nearly as great as the Bible, but as great as it is, if you really look at the history of our nation, we haven't really followed it very well for, I don't know if we ever have. the way we should. And as a nation, we've been paying the price for that. Verse 15 says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." Notice he calls them hypocrites all the time. What is a hypocrite? One who says one thing and does another, right? You know, the do as I say, not as I do type person. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel land and sea to win one proselyte." In other words, to win a convert. "And when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves." They were winning converts and then placing all their traditions and all their rules of living on these converts. Adding things to the Old Testament, what we would call the Old Testament. Adding things to it, in fact, to the point where they really weren't teaching the Old Testament really anymore. Obviously, they didn't know what it said. We have whole denominations that do this. Secret ceremonies and dietary restrictions and on and on and on and on. Verse 16, "Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gold of the temple that sanctifies the gold?" Or excuse me, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold. That's what I meant to say. "And whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that is on it, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? Therefore he who swears by the altar, swears by it and by all things on it. He who swears by the temple, swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven, swears by the throne of God and by him who sits on it." So the Pharisees had this thing where, you know, they would swear by something. And they would not allow people to swear by the temple, but you could swear by the gold that's, you know, that the temple is decorated with. Folks, if you have to swear by something, that means you're probably lying. Right? Those of us who have ever been in law enforcement, have ever interrogated anyone, we know that when a person says 3 times in a row they didn't do something, and each time they escalate the way they swear by it, "I didn't do it. I swear I didn't do it. I swear to God I didn't do it." Bam, you've just caught them in a lie. That's why people swear by something. So it was a big deal for them. Maybe to us it isn't a big deal, but for them it was. And Jesus is calling them fools and blind. You know, why do you differentiate something, right? And say, "Well, I swear, you know." No, don't do that. And yet, when we're trying to cover up falsehood, right? When we're trying to cover up our own failings, when we're trying to cover up our own lies, we will come up with some type of methodology, right, to make it sound good. And that's what they were doing. They were making it sound good. Christians, we gotta guard ourselves from trying to make things sound good. There's another passage where Jesus says, "Let your yes be yes and your no be no." Don't swear by anything, right? So as a pastor, I can't do that either. Imagine if I said, you know, "I swear by the pulpit." It's just a chunk of oak, I think. Veneer, right? It's just a piece of wood. Why would I swear by any item or anything? Silly. Verse 23 says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe." They tithed of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. So the Pharisees, they had so many rules about tithing, you know, giving 1/10 of everything, right? They're giving 1/10 of their spices out of their wives' kitchen cupboards. Women, if you've ever wondered why your spices are dwindling, just kidding on that one. That's how far their traditions had gone. God had never said, to tie all the stuff in your kitchen. But they were so focused on all those little rules that they forgot the weightier matters of the law. What are the 2 greatest commandments? Jesus told us, because he was asked by the Pharisees, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind. And the second is like it, to love your neighbors yourself. They had forgotten that. Those are the weightier matters of the law. The 2 most important commandments. And they had set all that aside to follow all their little rules. Jesus even takes it to the point where he says, blind guys, you strain out a gnat. They were so worried about eating something that was technically ceremonially unclean. Gnats are ceremonially unclean. I don't like to swallow gnats. Anybody here ever swallowed a gnat or a mosquito accidentally, or a fly? Right? It's gross. They would actually strain their wine before they drank it. Anything, they would strain it just to make sure. Jesus says, and of course he's using hyperbole here, right? These are figures of speech. He's saying they're so worried they're trying to strain out something super small, but yet they swallow a camel. A camel is also an unclean animal to the Jew. In other words, they're super nitpicky, but yet they're extremely sinful at the same time. We could be the same way. See, they are forgetting about justice. Some translations may call that judgment, same word. Judgment, justice come from the same word. About justice and mercy and faith. They've forgotten all about that. Christians, we can't forget that stuff. I'm not talking about the current, vibe of social justice. That's silly. That's not justice at all. I'm talking about doing what is right for others. Maybe you've heard the term, do unto others and run. That's not what we're supposed to do. That's what politicians do. That's what the Pharisees were kind of doing, spiritually. Maybe even physically. Right? Do unto others as we would want others to do unto us. That's not an unbiblical philosophy. Justice and mercy go together. And so do faith. We have to remember to cling to that. Verse 25 says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of extortion and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first cleanse the inside of the cup and dish, that the outside of them may be clean also. Again, it's hyperbole. He's not talking about washing dishes. He's not talking about, when we used to, in the old days when you used to pass the common communion cup, right? That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about you, me, inside. The Pharisees, they made a big deal about physically being clean and having clean clothes and making themselves look good and wearing fancy robes. It kind of reminds me of, when you see, in certain churches, the priest puts on the fancy robe with the gold sash and all that kind of stuff, and maybe wearing a funny hat, walking around. Or we used to call the man of the cloth, right? The black jacket with the white, who wants to wear that? We try to make it look good, right? So they were making it look good on the outside, but on the inside they're full of sin. He's telling them, he's telling us, we need to have our inside cleansed. We need to be cleansed of sin. And if we're cleansed in our hearts, what the public sees will then truly be a clean person, clean of sin. Verse 27, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Even so, you also outwardly appear righteous to man, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Last month on our trip, we stopped in Virginia City, Nevada, early one morning on our way back from Village Missions Conference, and went to one of the big old cemeteries. Of course, Virginia City was a very wealthy mining town at one time. Right now, it's just a tourist trap. But you can see the big, giant, fancy gravestones. I mean, tall ones. Those were expensive back then. And it's pretty well kept. But what is that tombstone sitting on top of? The remains of a corpse. Of course, our cemetery in La Pine is very pioneer-like, right? It's rustic. I kind of like it, actually. Let's say you go to the big. Let's pick on one of the biggest ones in the United States, Arlington National Cemetery. Beautiful grounds, right? Same thing all across France and Belgium and places in Europe. The World War I and the World War II cemeteries. Manicured, beautiful grass. Beautiful place to go and contemplate, full of white crosses. But what's in the ground underneath? So these Pharisees were like these tombstones. Where on the outside they looked great, wealthy, rich. But on the inside they were spiritually dead. Christians, we have to make sure that we are not spiritually dead on the inside. And when we begin to worship politicians instead of Jesus Christ, we are going to become spiritually dead on the inside. We'll forget about Jesus and we're going to follow our guy. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. This is another kind of cemetery thing. Because you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous and say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. See, the Jewish religious leaders killed a lot of the Old Testament prophets because they didn't like what they had to say. During the days of Isaiah and Jeremiah and others, as Israel has been split into two and then is being attacked from the outside and people are being carried away captive, and you got the ruling class hunkered down in Jerusalem. A lot of these prophets were saying, hey, if you don't change your ways, this guy Nebuchadnezzar is going to come get you. They didn't like that. So they put some of them in prison. They tortured some and others they killed. Verse 31 says, therefore you are witnesses against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Serpents, brood of vipers. What a horrible thing to call people, right? Now this is Jesus. How can you escape the condemnation of hell? Therefore indeed, I send you prophets, wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. You'll find that in 2 Chronicles. Surely I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. So these religious leaders, they would say things like, well, if we had been alive back then, we wouldn't have killed those prophets. Yet these Pharisees are descendants of the very people who did kill the prophets. And guess what they did? They had Jesus Christ killed. They were witnesses against themselves when they identified with, well, we wouldn't have done that. Look at us. You know, the graves and the monuments that we have to those guys. We keep them all nice and neat and clean. But yet what did come upon them? Because this is a prophecy here. What did come upon the religious leaders of Israel in the 1st century AD. They were wiped out. The government of Rome had finally had enough of them. And maybe other reasons too. And beginning in about 66 AD, the Roman army besieged Rome, surrounded it. No one could come in. No one could go in. Nobody could come out. They eventually ran out of food. They began to cannibalize each other. They began to eat each other. And in 70 AD, the Roman army under Emperor Titus stormed Jerusalem and destroyed it down to the last stone. Those things did come upon that generation. What's coming upon our generation today, I can't say. If the church finds itself in this position of acting like the Pharisees, how is Jesus going to judge the church? I'm using this universally. All denominations in all cities and towns around the world. How is Jesus going to judge the church? It's Peter that tells us, and it's either 1st or 2nd Peter. I don't remember the exact reference, but it's there. So go read it for yourself. That judgment starts with the church. We want judgment to occur on a particular political party, don't we? Well, I'm sorry, folks, but judgment begins here. Are we ready for that? We should be. You need to be. But if we begin to act like the Pharisees and the scribes and treat people who think differently than we do with utter contempt, if we spread the rumors, the lies, the conspiracies, all to make ourselves feel better, we're not any different than they were. And then Jesus says this to Jerusalem. Think about what's happening in Israel today. They're at war. On at least two sides right now, if you want to look at it geographically. Not only do you have Gaza Strip on the west side, and the Hamas organization, and the Palestinians, and whoever they are, okay? And then to the north, you've got Hezbollah coming out of Lebanon. That's north of Israel. They're at war there too. Israel today still, nationally, does not recognize Jesus of Nazareth as their Messiah. They're still waiting for someone. Unfortunately, that someone, whenever they declare someone to be their Messiah, for at least a short period of time, is going to be the guy we call the Antichrist, and we don't know who that is. So Jerusalem has not really changed much in 2,000 years. Let's see what Jesus says about him 2,000 years ago. He says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings." He sang that song, under his wings, right? "But you were not willing." Jesus once wanted to wrap the residents of Jerusalem in his arms. He wanted to love on the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees, but they would have nothing to do with it. It's like they ran out from under his protection. They rebelled. He says, "See," verse 38, "See, your house is left to you desolate, empty," because Jesus was going to leave them. And he did. Verse 39 says, "For I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." That has not happened yet. Israel, Jerusalem, has not yet recognized who Jesus is. They will someday. But in order for that day to come, there's got to be a lot of bad days in between. Sure, there's bad days in our country, but I'm here to tell you, yesterday was not the first time someone has tried to assassinate either a sitting president or a presidential candidate in the history of this country. Right? I mean, I remember when Reagan was shot, I was a freshman in high school. That was a big deal. Some of you, well, most of you who are, older than me will remember when JFK was assassinated. Some of you might even remember when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Okay? Or William McKinley. These things happen, don't they? They shouldn't happen, but they do. Because we live in a sinful world. Fellow Christians, brothers and sisters, let us look at the woes to the Pharisees. If you can identify a place in your life, in your heart, where you can maybe put yourself there, confess that sin to the Lord. Turn away from that. Follow Jesus Christ. Say now, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Jesus grieves in this entire chapter. He's grieving over Jerusalem. He's not grieving over the buildings. Buildings come and buildings go. He's not grieving over the temple because by then that was the third temple in Jerusalem, right? And it's gone now. He's grieving over the people and where their hearts are. And I gotta wonder, when he looks at the church, whether it's La Pine Community Church, any other church in La Pine, any other church around the world, anyone that proclaims to be a Christian church, I gotta think in a lot of cases he's grieving over us right now. Whether it's our stance on the, whatever issue, right? The alphabet soup issue, stance on abortion, or our political leanings. Is he grieving over the church? I would say probably in a lot of cases. I don't want to be one to cause Jesus grief. When he returns, I want to be found ready. Whenever that is. And since we don't know, I got to be ready all the time, don't I? I can't be unprepared. I have to always be ready. I have to always guard my heart. Boy, I tell you, in the last, 12 hours or so, it's been a lot easier to watch all the different pundits on YouTube and the internet and TV than it is to study my Bible. But in the grand scheme of things, yesterday is just a bump in the road. It's just one among many, isn't it? And it brings us closer and closer. Every day that goes by, we are closer to the rapture of the church and the second coming of Christ. That's what I'm looking forward to. So he's going to put an end to all this political silliness. Can I get an amen on that? Amen. Well, that was not very... I think some of you are still kind of laser locked in on your guy. Your guy is Jesus Christ. Amen. Nobody else. He got more than a hole in his ear. And I'm not trying to downplay what happened yesterday. I'm glad he survived. I feel bad for the families of those who died in those bleachers. I feel bad for the family of the shooter. I doubt that they asked him to do that. And I look forward to that day. And I want to get caught and ready. Let's now prepare our hearts for communion. Let's just have a little silent time for just a minute. Father, I confess to you of being distracted by the world. having my internal focus on myself and not on your kingdom. Fill me and fill us with your Spirit. That we can be found ready. When the trumpets blare, we are caught up to heaven with you. In Jesus' name, amen.